Number 6.
Probably lower than a lot of people think. I like the Chargers. Listen, they had the worst O-line in the league due to injuries and won 11 games in a good division. They're going to win 11 plus this year. They get Rashawn Slater and Joe Alt back at tackle. They have a ton of cap space, so they've addressed the interior O-line. They also added Mike McDaniel, who I think is one of those coordinators like Detroit's Drew Petzing that's going to be worth a win or 3. And they got a kind of a sneaky Keaton Mitchell, the running back, the speed back from Baltimore, comes over with Amarian Hampton. So I like what I see. I think this is going to be a team that's offense leads the way, unlike last year where defense had to lead the way. I have the Chargers at 6.
Before I launch into my enthusiastic breakdown of why I love the Los Angeles Chargers and how exceptional I believe they will be, I need to address a fundamental confusion that has plagued me throughout this entire offseason coverage. Colin mentioned having the Chargers lower than people might expect, and I still cannot figure out the proper terminology here. When we examine a top 10 ranking and say a team is ranked too high, does that mean they are actually worse than their position suggests, meaning a lower number would be more appropriate? Or does too high mean they should be elevated, which would be a higher number, but higher numbers in rankings actually indicate lower quality? The entire framework inverts itself. I genuinely cannot parse this after creating countless videos discussing these exact rankings. Someone please provide clarity, because I remain completely uncertain how to properly phrase these evaluations. It's a minor frustration, but one that persists every single time these discussions arise. Now, on to the Chargers themselves. I've engaged with numerous Chargers fans throughout this offseason, and a consistent sentiment emerges. They simply don't feel enough has happened during free agency. There's this underlying disappointment, this sense that the front office hasn't been aggressive enough, hasn't made enough splash moves to justify genuine optimism. And I understand where that feeling originates on an emotional level. Fans want activity. They want headlines. They want tangible evidence that their team is improving. But here's what I've been saying repeatedly, and Colin essentially articulated the same point. This team already won a significant number of games last season while fielding arguably the worst offensive line in football. That's not hyperbole. That's factual assessment. If they simply improve the offensive line, which they will by virtue of health alone, before even considering any schematic adjustments or personnel additions, that singular improvement carries massive implications. Let me construct a hypothetical to illustrate this point. Imagine the Chargers had $80 million available to spend in free agency. Now imagine they announced they were dedicating every single dollar of that $80 million exclusively to offensive line upgrades. Fans would be ecstatic. The reaction would be overwhelmingly positive. People would say, this is exactly what needed to happen. Look how many games we won last year with a terrible offensive line. Now we've finally fixed it. Let's go. That allocation alone would justify the entire spending spree. Here's the beautiful part. The Chargers are essentially achieving that exact outcome without spending that hypothetical $80 million. They're accomplishing offensive line improvement through natural health progression, combined with the addition of an elite offensive coach and coordinator. The line cannot possibly be worse than last season. Even if some players still deal with injuries, even if the unit isn't perfect, the minimum improvement floor is substantial. A 10% increase in pass block win rate, moving from the low 50s to something approaching 65%, would be absolutely massive on its own. Now combine that baseline improvement with elite offensive coaching. If you don't believe those two factors together will have a profound impact on this team, you fundamentally misunderstand the importance of both play calling and offensive line performance. What drives me crazy is how people selectively choose when these elements matter. They pick and choose based on which narrative they want to support. For me, there is no selection process. These things always matter. They matter every single season for every single team. Anyone attempting to push back on Chargers optimism, anyone refusing to acknowledge what they accomplished last season, is simply not being truthful about what they witnessed. The sheer fact that this team performed the way it did with questionable coaching and dreadful offensive line play should tell you everything. Now they have upgraded both categories. At minimum, the offensive line will be acceptable rather than catastrophic. To suggest this team won't improve, won't take a legitimate step forward, defies basic reasoning. How could they not get better? Someone would need to explain that logic to me. The next level of criticism inevitably shifts to postseason performance. People will concede regular season improvement, but argue it won't translate to January because Justin Herbert can't win in the playoffs. This is how you know the conversation is being manipulated. When someone says it won't matter because they still won't win a playoff game, they've moved the goalposts from team improvement to quarterback skepticism. At that point, you're questioning Herbert's very essence, his fundamental capacity to perform when it counts. Questioning Herbert's soul in March seems premature. His offensive line was terrible in his last 2 playoff appearances. We've seen what happens to other quarterbacks when their protection fails in the postseason. They look awful. They have no chance. In Herbert's first playoff game, on the road as a rookie, he played perfectly fine. He performed well. Yet for reasons that escape me, people want to assign blame to him for that loss. The narrative persists regardless of evidence. Then you encounter the Nick Wright approach, which takes skepticism to another level entirely. This framework suggests not only questioning Herbert's capabilities, but asserting that his playoff experiences have scarred him permanently. There's an implied defectiveness now, some irreversible damage from those losses. Wright has made this argument explicitly. Interestingly, he deploys identical logic about other teams within the Kansas City Chiefs division. He applies the same framework to the Denver Broncos and Bo Nix. The argument suggests that team won't recover from losing Nix to injury while nearly reaching the Super Bowl. The adversity will unravel them entirely. Then there's the New England Patriots and Drake May, the very franchise whose historical success threatens the Chiefs' legacy positioning. Because of May's Super Bowl performance, apparently he'll struggle to rebound. The pattern becomes obvious, yet the Philadelphia Eagles directly contradict this logic. Wright made similar pronouncements about them. And how did that work out? The Eagles absolutely crushed the Chiefs. By this same reasoning, shouldn't Kansas City never have recovered from that loss? Have the Chiefs looked the same since? Has Patrick Mahomes ever been the same? By the standards being applied elsewhere, the answers would suggest permanent decline. Mahomes looked great against Buffalo in the AFC Championship, less so against Philadelphia, and then where was the greatness after that? They didn't even make the playoffs. I'm not advancing these as my personal takes. I'm simply tracing the logical thread as it has been presented elsewhere. Don't accuse me of being a hater. I'm just observing the timeline and the arguments being made. This is what makes the offseason entertaining. You get to navigate these conflicting frameworks and ask why certain teams or players are doubted despite clear improvement. Why do you think they'll still fail when the conditions that caused previous failures have been addressed? That's when the conversation inevitably shifts to something intangible, some fundamental defect in the player's makeup that transcends circumstances. So I joke about questioning Justin Herbert's soul, but the underlying point is serious. You're essentially arguing that Herbert is fundamentally defective in ways that prevent playoff success. You're refusing to acknowledge that the specific factors contributing to those failures have been corrected or improved. Yet you still predict failure. The logic becomes circular. I'm admittedly a super nerd about this stuff. I find logical frameworks fascinating to an obnoxious degree. When I focus on someone's specific take, I go after the reasoning structure. Let's unpack the logic. If someone's argument follows A plus B equals C, we need to apply that same framework consistently. Then we have to explain why it doesn't apply in analogous situations. That's what I focus on. The logical consistency of the argument. The case for Chargers skepticism falls apart under this scrutiny. The logic being deployed simply doesn't hold together. Consider the final illustration. People argue the Chiefs will improve significantly with Eric Bieniemy back. They believe adding that coordinator will elevate Kansas City. Fair enough. But then the Chargers add a great coordinator, by most measures a more successful and respected coordinator at this point, and somehow they won't improve? The inconsistency is glaring. The same applies to offensive line discourse. The Chiefs line will be better this season, so they'll improve as a team. Mahomes will benefit. This is accepted as obvious. But when the Chargers' offensive line improves through health and coaching, somehow that doesn't translate to Herbert benefiting? Why doesn't the same logic apply? The only honest answer becomes simply not liking the Chargers. That's at least logically consistent. It's basic, elementary reasoning. If I presented this in a formal setting, people would be baffled I was explaining such fundamental concepts. They'd say we're not dumb, we understand how logic works. Yet in sports media, these inconsistencies persist constantly. People want to pretend this doesn't happen. I'm not talking about fans having emotional biases. I'm talking about media personalities constructing arguments that crumble under minimal scrutiny. If this is your argument for one team, what is your argument for the other? It's Logic 101, as elementary as it gets, yet strategically ignored when convenient. The Chargers currently exemplify this phenomenon perfectly. There are other examples throughout the league: the Eagles, the Broncos, the 49ers at various times. But right now, the Chargers provide a beautiful case study in mismanaged logic. It's especially perfect because it coincides with their division rival, the Kansas City Chiefs. And it aligns with prominent voices who apply one framework to support their preferred team while using another to dismiss the competition. This is what makes the discourse so fascinating to me. Even basic logical inconsistencies I love to examine because they reveal so much about how sports conversations actually function. When things are genuinely complex, I understand getting lost. I get lost constantly. But when people mismanage logic at this fundamental level, when you should understand what I'm saying and instead just disagree without coherent reasoning, I find that endlessly interesting. Maybe I'm just a nerd. Maybe this doesn't matter to anyone else. But those are my thoughts on the Chargers and the logic surrounding their offseason perception. Colin has them ranked 6th. Do you think they'll take a step forward? Is this ranking too low or too high? And please clarify what you mean by that terminology, because I genuinely remain confused. I just don't know anymore. Share your thoughts in the comments. I read every single response, whether agreement or disagreement drives your perspective. Let's generate meaningful discussion, maybe some healthy debate, but ultimately keep it enjoyable. Please consider subscribing if you appreciate this content. We're building a community that I hope feels genuinely connected and invested. Your participation matters enormously. Remember to like this video as it supports visibility and algorithmic reach. Thank you for watching. I'll see you in the next discussion.